A black billionaire has spent 20 years caring for his paralyzed son, sacrificing everything for his safety. But one day, suspecting something amiss, he installs cameras in the house. What he saw changed his life forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The rising sun painted golden streaks across the sprawling skyline as the city emerged from its slumber. From the top floor of the Kane estate, the glass walls framed the awakening metropolis below, a kingdom of steel and glass stretching out in all directions. Jonathan Kane stood by the window, his silhouette cast long and sharp against the pale morning light. Despite the grandeur of the penthouse, the man at its center looked burdened. His sharp features were softened by sleepless nights, and the faint silver at his temples hinted at years of relentless work. Jonathan's dark skin seemed to absorb the morning glow, but his eyes betrayed a deeper storm, one that the city below could never know. He sipped coffee from a porcelain cup, its surface reflecting the muted colors of dawn, and allowed his thoughts to wander back through time. For a man whose empire spanned industries and continents, Jonathan was, at heart, still the boy who had fought tooth and nail to survive on the unforgiving streets of Baltimore. The memories lingered, nights spent hungry, the sound of police sirens echoing through narrow alleyways, and the sting of shame when his mother's tearful prayers failed to keep the lights on. Yet, here he was now, surrounded by the kind of wealth that once felt unreachable, a testament to his determination. But as he looked out at his kingdom, it wasn't pride that filled him. It was fear. Behind him, the faint hum of machinery cut through the silence. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. The sound of wheels rolling across polished marble had become as familiar as his own breath. "Mornin', Dad," said a voice that carried both warmth and fragility. Jonathan turned to see his son, Elijah, sitting in his custom-designed wheelchair. The young man's light brown complexion echoed his mother's softer features, while his eyes, sharp and probing, were unmistakably his father's. But unlike Jonathan, Elijah's body seemed frail, locked in a prison of immobility since the accident that changed their lives 7 years ago. "Mornin', son," Jonathan forced a smile, setting his cup down. "How did you sleep?" "Like a rock," Elijah said, grinning. "Not that I had much choice." He gestured at the wheelchair with practiced humor, but Jonathan caught the flicker of something darker beneath it. Jonathan approached, crouching down to meet his son's eye level. He reached out, placing a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Don't joke like that." Elijah shrugged, brushing off the concern. "If I can't laugh at it, what's the point?" Jonathan hesitated. He admired his son's resilience, but there were moments, fleeting but real, when he wondered if the humor was a mask for something heavier. Breakfast arrived on a tray delivered by Sophia, the family's longtime housekeeper and assistant. She moved with practiced efficiency, her demeanor warm but professional. At 42, Sophia carried herself with quiet elegance, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and her tailored suit highlighting the precision with which she approached her work. "Good morning, Mr. Kane." "Elijah," she said, setting the tray down on the table between them. "Thanks, Sophia," Elijah said, flashing a smile. Jonathan only nodded, his attention still fixed on his son. As they ate, Jonathan couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. It had started a few weeks ago, little things. Elijah's foot twitching when he thought no one was looking. The way his hands gripped the wheels of his chair with more force than usual. Movements too subtle for anyone else to notice, but glaring to a man who had spent years watching over his son's every move. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp click of dress shoes against marble. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. "Good morning, Mr. Kane." The voice was clipped, professional, and carried just the faintest edge of condescension. "Daniel," Jonathan said, straightening. Daniel Harper stepped into the room like he owned it. At 53, he was a man whose confidence bordered on arrogance. With his crisp navy suit, silver tie, and polished shoes, he looked more like a politician than a corporate advisor, and in many ways he was both. Jonathan regarded him carefully, masking his irritation behind a neutral expression. "Reports are on your desk," Daniel said, sparing only the briefest glance at Elijah. "I flagged a few areas of concern. We need to discuss them before the afternoon call with the board." Jonathan nodded, but something about Daniel's tone made his jaw tighten. The man had always been professional, but there was an undercurrent to his words that Jonathan had learned to recognize. A barely concealed belief that he didn't belong here, that his success was a fluke. "I'll review them shortly," Jonathan replied. "Anything urgent?" Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing that can't wait," but his eyes said otherwise. Jonathan waited until Daniel left before turning back to Elijah. "You'll be okay for a while?" Elijah rolled his eyes. "Dad, I'm not a child. I'll be fine." Jonathan smiled, but the knot in his stomach tightened. As he retreated to his study, the unease followed him. He sat at his desk, surrounded by awards and framed newspaper articles celebrating his achievements, but they offered no comfort. Instead, his eyes drifted to the monitor in the corner of the room. He opened the surveillance feed, something he had installed months ago, telling himself it was for security. But as the images flickered across the screen, his focus narrowed to one feed in particular: Elijah's room. The camera captured everything: the neatly made bed, the bookshelves stacked with novels and medical journals, and the wheelchair parked beside the desk. Elijah was reading, his head tilted slightly as he scanned the pages. Jonathan almost turned it off. Almost. But then it happened. Elijah set the book down and glanced toward the door. After a long pause, he reached for the armrests of his wheelchair. Jonathan leaned forward, his breath caught in his throat. Slowly, painfully, Elijah shifted his weight and pushed himself up. His legs trembled, but he stood, unsupported. For a moment, he looked unsteady, his arms stretched out for balance. Then he took a step. Jonathan's heart pounded. Another step. Elijah gritted his teeth, pushing through the strain. Then, with visible effort, he lowered himself back into the wheelchair, his face pale but triumphant. Jonathan sank back in his chair, his hands trembling. Relief, anger, and confusion collided inside him. His son could walk, and he'd been lying about it for months. As the weight of the discovery settled, Jonathan's gaze shifted to the closed door of his office. Somewhere out there, Daniel Harper was circling, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Jonathan's instincts screamed that this was more than coincidence. He had enemies inside his walls, and his son's secret might be the weapon they'd been waiting for. The pale glow of the computer screen cast sharp shadows across Jonathan Kane's study. The room, usually a sanctuary of order and control, now felt suffocating. Papers lay scattered across the dark oak desk, some crumpled from the grip of his trembling hands. The only sound was the faint hum of the security system and the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock mounted above the bookshelf. Yet, for Jonathan, the world had fallen silent. He stared at the paused frame on the monitor, the image frozen in time like a damning confession. Elijah stood on shaky legs, arms outstretched, his expression a mix of fear and triumph. Jonathan's eyes burned as he replayed the moment in his mind. Over and over, he saw his son rise from the wheelchair, defying years of assumptions, pity, and sacrifice. His heart pounded. He wanted to feel relief, pride even, at the sight of Elijah's resilience, but instead, anger and betrayal tightened his chest like a vice. Why? Why would his son hide this from him? Why pretend to be broken when he clearly wasn't? Jonathan leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, willing his pulse to slow, but the image of Elijah standing upright remained seared into his thoughts. Memories surged unbidden. The hospital lights flickering overhead, the sterile smell of antiseptics, and the doctor's grim expression as he explained the extent of Elijah's spinal injuries. Jonathan had spent countless nights at his son's bedside, holding his hand and whispering promises that everything would be okay. He had poured millions into therapy and rehabilitation programs, refused to take no for an answer, and turned his empire into a fortress to protect his son from a world he feared might see him as weak. And now? Jonathan rose abruptly, pacing the length of the room. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows looked like that of a stranger. Shoulders hunched, eyes shadowed, and jaw clenched. He couldn't shake the gnawing suspicion that something far more sinister lay beneath Elijah's deception. Was someone manipulating him? Threatening him? A knock at the door shattered his thoughts. "Sir?" Sophia's voice was calm but carried a hint of concern. Jonathan quickly minimized the footage and turned toward the door. "Come in." Sophia entered, holding a leather-bound planner against her chest. Her sharp eyes swept over the mess on his desk before settling on him. "I didn't mean to interrupt, but Mr. Harper left these documents for your review. He said it was urgent." Jonathan's lips pressed into a thin line at the mention of Daniel. He took the folder from her outstretched hands but didn't open it. "Thank you, Sophia. That'll be all." She hesitated, her gaze lingering on him. "Is everything all right, sir?" Jonathan forced a nod. "Fine." The door closed behind her, but Jonathan's attention was already back on the screen. He reopened the surveillance footage, fast-forwarding through the recordings from the past week. Each clip added weight to the storm building inside him. Elijah was careful, only attempting to stand when he thought no one was watching. Sometimes he managed a few steps, other times he collapsed back into the chair, panting and shaken but never given up. Jonathan's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the desk. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was deliberate. He needed answers. Grabbing his phone, Jonathan dialed the head of his security team. The call was brief, a request to review all activity logs and visitor records for the estate. If anyone had been influencing Elijah, Jonathan would find out. But as he hung up, another thought struck him. What if this wasn't just about Elijah? What if someone else was involved? His mind immediately went to Daniel Harper. The man had been circling like a vulture for months, finding excuses to probe into Jonathan's personal life and financial records. Jonathan had dismissed it as corporate paranoia, but now the timing felt too convenient. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at the office earlier than usual. The boardroom was empty, but the faint aroma of coffee lingered in the air. He stood at the head of the table, gazing out at the city below. When the door opened, he didn't turn. "You're here early," Daniel said. His voice carried its usual polished arrogance, but there was a slight edge to it. Jonathan finally faced him. "I had some things to think about." Daniel smirked. "Haven't we all?" Jonathan studied him carefully. The older man's pale blue eyes gleamed with something unreadable, and his perfectly combed hair gave him an almost artificial quality, polished yet hollow. "I reviewed your report. Jonathan said, tossing the folder onto the table. Interest in numbers, especially the discrepancies in the overseas accounts. Daniel's expression didn't falter, but his fingers tightened around the handle of his briefcase. I assure you, everything is in order. Perhaps the stress is, don't. The single word hung in the air like a threat. Daniel tilted his head. Excuse me? Don't insult me by pretending this is business as usual. You've been angling for control since the day you walked into this company. Daniel chuckled, but the sound was hollow. Paranoia doesn't suit you, Jonathan. Maybe you should take some time off. Relax. Jonathan stepped closer, his voice dropping. If I find out you've been digging into my family, into my son, relaxation will be the least of your concerns. For the first time, Daniel's mask slipped. His smirk faded, replaced by something colder. Be careful, Jonathan. Empires fall faster than you think. Jonathan held his gaze, unblinking. Not mine. That night, Jonathan sat in his study again, but this time he wasn't just observing. He rewound the footage to the point where Elijah stood. He watched his son's face, saw the fear, the hesitation, and finally, the determination. Jonathan's anger wavered. He saw himself in that moment, the same fire that had driven him to fight his way out of poverty, to defy every expectation and obstacle. But why keep it hidden? His phone buzzed, breaking the spell. It was Sophia. Sir, you need to see this. Jonathan frowned. What is it? It's about Mr. Harper, she said, her voice uncharacteristically tense. You were right to be suspicious. There's something you need to know. Jonathan's stomach dropped. Send it to me, he said. As the email notification popped up, Jonathan opened the attachment, his eyes scanning the documents. Bank transfers, private meetings with competitors, proof. Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened. This wasn't just about Elijah's secret anymore. It was war. The Kane estate loomed against the night sky like a fortress, its glass walls reflecting the lights of the city below. Yet, despite the fortress-like appearance, Jonathan Kane felt exposed. The discovery of his son's secret and the damning evidence against Daniel Harper had shattered the illusion of control he had so carefully constructed. The weight of betrayal, both from his son and his most trusted advisor, pressed heavily against his chest as he paced the length of his study. Outside the windows, the skyline seemed distant, detached from the storm brewing within these walls. The flickering lights of passing cars mirrored the disjointed rhythm of Jonathan's thoughts. He replayed the events of the past 24 hours in his mind. Elijah's deception was one thing, but Daniel's machinations threatened to upend everything he had built, not just the company, but the very foundation of his family's security. He could deal with the corporate battles. He had faced competitors, lawsuits, and hostile takeovers before. But this was personal. Jonathan turned away from the window and sat down at his desk. The leather chair creaked beneath his weight as he leaned forward, elbows on the polished surface, and stared at the documents Sophia had sent him earlier. Bank statements, secret meetings, wire transfers. It was all there, a paper trail leading straight to Daniel Harper. He clenched his fists. The betrayal cut deeper than he wanted to admit. Daniel had been his ally for over a decade, a man he had trusted with his business and, in many ways, his family. And now that trust had been reduced to ashes. Jonathan's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. He didn't need to ask who it was. Come in. Elijah wheeled himself into the study, his face shadowed with uncertainty. Jonathan noted the hesitation in his son's movements, the way his fingers tightened around the rims of his wheelchair, the slight tremor in his voice when he spoke. "Dad, we need to talk." Jonathan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured for Elijah to move closer. "Sit," Jonathan said, motioning to one of the leather chairs across the desk. Elijah hesitated before transferring himself from the wheelchair. Jonathan noted the ease with which he did it, the muscle memory betraying years of practice. The sight sent another pang of anger through him, but he forced himself to remain calm. "You've had plenty of opportunities to talk, Elijah," Jonathan said, his voice low but steady. "Why now?" Elijah swallowed hard. "Because you know." Jonathan arched an eyebrow. "Know what?" "That I can walk," Elijah admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent. Jonathan leaned back, his gaze never leaving his son. "Why?" Jonathan finally asked, his tone sharper than he intended. "Why would you hide this from me? From everyone?" Elijah's eyes darted away. "I didn't think I was ready." "Ready for what?" "For everything," Elijah snapped, his voice rising. "For the expectations, for the questions, for you looking at me like you are right now." Jonathan flinched at the rawness in his son's voice. "You think I wanted this?" Elijah continued, his hands trembling. "You think I wanted to sit in this chair and feel useless while the world moved on without me? I didn't ask for any of it." Jonathan's anger wavered, replaced by something heavier, guilt. "Elijah." "No." Elijah cut him off. "Let me finish." Jonathan nodded, leaning back to let his son speak. "I started trying to walk again months ago," Elijah admitted, his voice softer now. "At first, it was just small things, moving my toes, trying to stand, but it was never enough. Every time I thought I was making progress, I'd fall. And every time I fell, I saw the disappointment in your eyes even though you weren't there." Jonathan's throat tightened. "I didn't want to let you down," Elijah said, looking directly at him. "So I pretended I wasn't getting better, pretended I wasn't scared out of my mind that I'd never be enough for you or for this family." Jonathan felt his carefully constructed walls begin to crack. "You think I care about that?" Jonathan asked, his voice raw. "Do you think for one second I care about whether you're perfect? You're my son, Elijah. That's all that matters." Elijah shook his head. "You don't get it. I watched you build this empire. I watched you fight for every inch of it, and I couldn't even stand on my own 2 feet. I didn't just want to be your son. I wanted to be someone you could be proud of." Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, but a sharp knock interrupted them. "Mr. Kane?" It was Sophia again, her voice urgent. Jonathan stood, anger flashing in his eyes. "This isn't a good time, Sophia." "I'm sorry, sir," she said, "but it's Daniel." Jonathan stiffened. "What about him?" "He's here." Jonathan strode into the living room, Elijah trailing behind him. Daniel Harper stood near the grand piano, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. "Jonathan," Daniel said, his voice smooth as silk, "we need to talk." Jonathan crossed his arms. "We have nothing to discuss." Daniel smirked. "Oh, I think we do." He held up a folder and tossed it onto the coffee table. Jonathan opened it, his blood running cold as he scanned the contents. Photos of Elijah walking. Copies of the surveillance footage. "You've been keeping secrets," Daniel said, "and I'm guessing the board won't be too happy to find out." Jonathan's fists clenched. "You've been spying on my family?" "Spying?" Daniel feigned innocence. "I'd call it protecting the company. After all, if word got out that your son has been lying, it might raise some questions about your leadership." Elijah stepped forward. "You can't do this." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Can't I?" Jonathan took a step closer, towering over Daniel. "You listen to me. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're not going to win this." Daniel smirked. "We'll see." After Daniel left, Jonathan turned to Elijah. "We're not letting him get away with this," he said. Elijah nodded, determination replacing the fear in his eyes. And for the first time in years, Jonathan saw his son not as someone who needed protection, but as someone ready to fight. The Kane estate had always stood as a monument to power and success, yet tonight it felt fragile, like a castle built on sand, ready to collapse under the weight of long-buried secrets. Jonathan Kane sat in his study, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting elongated shadows across the walls. He leaned forward, elbows on the polished mahogany, his hands tightly clasped as if holding himself together. The confrontation with Daniel Harper hours earlier still replayed in his mind. The man's smug expression, the veiled threats, and the folder filled with damning evidence lingered like a bitter aftertaste. But it wasn't just Daniel's betrayal that haunted him. It was Elijah's confession, the raw fear and shame in his son's voice as he admitted to hiding his recovery. Jonathan felt the weight of failure pressing down on him. He had built an empire, yet somehow he had failed to build trust within his own family. His son had lived in fear of his judgment, and the man he had trusted to help him run his company had become his greatest enemy. A faint knock at the door broke his thoughts. "Come in," he said, his voice hoarse. Elijah wheeled into the room, the silence between them heavy. He looked different tonight, less like the vulnerable boy Jonathan had been protecting for years, and more like a man ready to face the storm ahead. "Dad," Elijah started, his voice steadier than before, "we need to talk, for real this time." Jonathan gestured for him to come closer, resisting the urge to take control of the conversation. He had spent too long dictating, protecting, and assuming. Tonight, he needed to listen. Elijah drew in a shaky breath. "There's more you need to know." Jonathan braced himself. "I'm listening." Elijah looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his sleeve. "It started about a year ago," he said. "I was tired of feeling helpless, tired of people looking at me like I was broken. So I started trying, small things at first, moving my toes, then my legs. It hurt, but I kept pushing." Jonathan swallowed hard, picturing his son struggling in silence. "It was Sophia who noticed first," Elijah continued. "She caught me trying to stand one night and didn't say anything at first. She just started helping me quietly, supporting me when I fell, encouraging me when I wanted to quit." Jonathan's eyes widened. "Sophia knew?" Elijah nodded. "She never told you because I begged her not to. I wasn't ready for you to know. I didn't want you to see me fail." Jonathan exhaled slowly, his anger tempered by a newfound respect for Sophia's loyalty. "But it didn't stay between us," Elijah admitted. "Daniel found out." Jonathan's body tensed. "How?" Elijah's expression darkened. "I don't know. Cameras, maybe. Or maybe he just started paying closer attention. But once he knew, everything changed." Jonathan leaned forward. "What did he do?" "He started showing up unannounced, asking questions, dropping hints about my progress. At first, I thought he was trying to encourage me, but then he started pushing." Elijah's voice faltered. "He told me that if I didn't keep my mouth shut about what I could do, he'd make sure the board found out, and not just about me." Jonathan's blood ran cold. "What else did he threaten?" Elijah hesitated, then looked his father in the eye. "You?" Jonathan froze. "He said he had information, proof that you weren't as clean as you pretended to be, that the company had secrets, and if they came out, you'd lose everything." Jonathan felt the room spin. "I didn't know what to do," Elijah continued. "I didn't want to be the reason you lost the company, so I kept pretending, hoping he'd let it go. But he didn't. He just kept pushing." Jonathan stood abruptly, pacing the room. His heart pounded as the pieces fell into place. Daniel hadn't just stumbled upon Elijah's secret. He had been watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But there was something else, something that didn't add up. "Elijah," Jonathan said carefully, "what secrets? What does Daniel think he has on me?" Elijah shook his head. He didn't say, just that it had to do with money, offshore accounts, shady deals. I didn't believe him, but Jonathan's stomach churned. He had spent years keeping his nose clean, refusing to cut corners or take shortcuts, yet his father's legacy cast a long shadow. Memories surfaced, late nights as a young man, poring over contracts and bank statements, trying to untangle the web of questionable deals his father had left behind. He had thought he'd erased all traces of those skeletons, but what if Daniel had found something he missed? The thought sent a chill down his spine. "We're not running from this," Jonathan said firmly. "Not anymore." The next morning, Jonathan met Sophia in the dining room where she was setting the table for breakfast. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. She looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Of course, sir." Jonathan motioned for her to sit. "Elijah told me everything." Sophia's shoulders tensed, but she didn't flinch. "I only did what I thought was best." Jonathan nodded. "I'm not angry. If anything, I'm grateful you were there for him when I wasn't. But I need to know, did Daniel ever approach you?" Sophia's lips pressed into a thin line. "Once. He asked questions about Elijah's progress. He made it seem harmless at first, but it felt wrong. I told him I didn't know anything, but I think he suspected I was lying." Jonathan exhaled sharply. "I need your help, Sophia. If we're going to stop Daniel, we need to know exactly what he has and who else might be involved." Sophia nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes." By nightfall, Jonathan sat in his study, surrounded by files, ledgers, and bank statements. Sophia's investigation had already turned up more discrepancies, irregularities buried so deeply they would have gone unnoticed if not for her meticulous eye. The evidence painted a clear picture. Daniel had been siphoning funds and laundering money through offshore accounts, likely using Jonathan's name to cover his tracks. Jonathan's anger burned hotter with every page he read. This wasn't just corporate sabotage. It was war. And Daniel Harper had just made it personal. The Kane estate sat cloaked in shadow as the night stretched on. Inside the dimly lit study, Jonathan Kane leaned over his desk, papers and folders strewn across its polished surface. The ticking of the grandfather clock filled the silence, each second a reminder of how little time remained. Sophia's investigation had unearthed damning evidence, enough to bury Daniel Harper if wielded correctly. But the game was far from over. Jonathan's eyes burned from hours of scanning documents, tracing the intricate web of financial manipulations Daniel had woven. Offshore accounts, dummy corporations, and unauthorized transactions. It was all there. Yet, despite the evidence, a nagging doubt gnawed at him. Daniel was too meticulous to leave loose ends. If Jonathan had found this much, it meant Daniel wanted him to find it. The thought sent a chill down his spine. A soft knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. "Come in." Elijah wheeled himself inside, his face set in a determined expression. He no longer looked like the frightened boy who had confessed his secrets just days ago. Instead, he carried himself with a quiet resolve that reminded Jonathan of his younger self. "Dad," Elijah began, "we need to act." Jonathan nodded, motioning for him to sit. "I know, but we can't afford any mistakes. Daniel's not just playing defense anymore. He's making his move." Elijah clenched his fists. "I won't let him ruin everything you've built." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying his son. "It's not just about the company, Elijah. This is about you too. If Daniel exposes your secret, then let him," Elijah interrupted. "I'm done hiding. I'll face whatever comes." Jonathan felt a swell of pride, but also a pang of fear. "It's not that simple. Once this gets out, there's no going back. The board will question everything, and the media will tear us apart." Elijah met his gaze. "Let them. I won't let my fear give Daniel the upper hand." Before Jonathan could respond, Sophia entered the room, her face pale but composed. "We have a problem," she said, placing her tablet on the desk. "Daniel's already started making his move." Jonathan leaned forward as Sophia tapped the screen, bringing up a series of emails and financial statements. "He's been in contact with members of the board," Sophia explained. "He's spinning the story, claiming that you mismanaged company funds and that Elijah's deception is proof you can't be trusted." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "How many of them are listening?" "Too many," Sophia admitted. "But there's more." She swiped to another document. "He's arranged a meeting tomorrow morning. The agenda, a vote of no confidence." Elijah's eyes widened. "He's trying to take the company." Jonathan stood, his fists clenched. "He won't get away with this." Across town, Daniel Harper sat in the private lounge of an exclusive club, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The room was dimly lit, its leather chairs and dark wood paneling exuding wealth and power. Daniel leaned back, savoring the burn of the liquor as he watched the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Opposite him sat Marcus Bellinger, one of the board members Jonathan had fought so hard to win over years ago. Tonight, Marcus looked more nervous than usual, his fingers tapping against the edge of his glass. "You're sure about this?" Marcus asked. Daniel smiled. "Positive. Kane's empire is built on lies. Once the board sees the evidence, they'll have no choice but to back me." Marcus frowned. "And the son? Won't the sympathy angle play in their favor?" Daniel's smile widened. "Not once they realize he's been lying about his condition for months. The media will tear them apart, and when they do, Kane's reputation will crumble." Marcus hesitated, but Daniel leaned in. "This isn't just about taking Kane down," he said. "It's about putting the company back in the right hands. Hands that know how to lead. You'll be rewarded for your loyalty." Marcus exhaled slowly. "I'll make the calls." Daniel raised his glass. "To the future." Back at the Kane estate, Jonathan stood by the window, staring out at the city below. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Elijah joined him, his reflection visible in the glass. "What's the plan?" Elijah asked. Jonathan's voice was steady. "We fight." The next morning, Jonathan arrived at the office early. The conference room was already buzzing with activity as board members filed in, their whispers filling the space. At the far end of the table sat Daniel, his posture relaxed but predatory. Jonathan took his seat at the head of the table, meeting each gaze with unflinching resolve. Daniel was the first to speak. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I know this meeting was called on short notice, but recent revelations have made it necessary." Jonathan leaned back, letting him talk. Daniel turned to the group. "We've all seen the evidence: irregularities in the finances, questionable decisions, and most troubling, the deception surrounding Mr. Kane's son. It's clear that this company is in crisis, and we can't afford to let it continue." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Jonathan stood, cutting through the noise. "What's clear," he said, "is that Mr. Harper has gone to great lengths to create this so-called crisis." Daniel's smile faltered. Jonathan continued, his voice sharp. "What he hasn't told you is that the irregularities he's so concerned about led directly back to him." He placed the files Sophia had compiled on the table, sliding them towards the nearest board member. "These documents detail unauthorized transfers, offshore accounts, and deals made without the board's approval, all traced to Mr. Harper." Daniel's face paled. "This is absurd." Jonathan cut him off. "No, Daniel, what's absurd is that you thought you could get away with it." For the first time, Daniel's confidence cracked. Jonathan pressed on. "I built this company on trust and transparency, values you clearly lack. But it's not just about the money. It's about loyalty. While I was protecting my family, you were stabbing me in the back." Daniel stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "You think this will save you? The board won't." "They already have," Sophia said, stepping into the room with the security team behind her. Jonathan gestured to them. "Escort Mr. Harper off the premises." Daniel's protests echoed through the room as he was led away, but Jonathan barely heard them. He turned to the board. "This company isn't perfect, and neither am I. But I've never lied about my intentions. If you stand with me, we'll rebuild stronger than ever." The room fell silent, and one by one, the board members nodded. As Jonathan left the meeting, Elijah was waiting outside. "How did it go?" Jonathan smiled. "We're still standing." Elijah grinned. "Then let's get to work." And for the first time in weeks, Jonathan felt hope. But he also knew the battle wasn't over. Daniel's fall was just the beginning. The echo of Daniel Harper's protests lingered long after the conference room doors had closed behind him. Jonathan Kane stood at the head of the table, his pulse still racing from the confrontation. The board members murmured among themselves, exchanging uneasy glances as security led Daniel away, but Jonathan barely noticed. Elijah stood just outside the glass walls of the boardroom, his wheelchair positioned in the corner of the hallway. His eyes met Jonathan's through the transparent barrier, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jonathan saw pride reflected in his son's gaze. Yet pride was not enough. Not yet. Jonathan turned back to the board. "I know this situation has shaken your confidence. Daniel Harper's actions were deliberate, calculated to undermine not just me but this entire company. However, the truth is now out. We cannot afford to let fear paralyze us." Marcus Bellinger, the board member Jonathan had always considered the most unpredictable, cleared his throat. "Mr. Kane, while I agree that Mr. Harper's behavior was unacceptable, the fact remains that questions about your leadership and your family's situation will not simply disappear." Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone measured. "I understand your concerns, Marcus. But this company was built on the principles of resilience and transparency. My son and I are prepared to face those questions together." At that moment, Elijah wheeled himself into the room. The murmurs stopped and all eyes shifted toward him. Jonathan's breath caught as Elijah reached for the arms of his chair. With deliberate movements, he pushed himself to stand. A collective gasp rippled through the board members as Elijah took a single step forward, his hands trembling but steady. "I'm not a victim." Elijah said, his voice clear despite the weight of the moment. And I'm not a liar. I've spent years rebuilding myself, learning to stand again, literally and figuratively. I made mistakes. I hid the truth because I was scared. But I'm done hiding. This company means everything to my father. It means everything to me. And I won't let Daniel Harper or anyone else tear it down. A stunned silence followed his words, broken only when Marcus rose to his feet and began clapping. One by one, the others joined him. Jonathan felt a surge of pride, tempered by the knowledge that the battle was far from over. Elijah's speech had bought them time, but Daniel had left scars that would not fade easily. That night, Jonathan returned to the estate, but the victory felt hollow. He sat alone in his study, surrounded by ledgers and reports, yet his thoughts kept drifting back to the confrontation and the questions it had raised. How far had Daniel's influence spread? How many others had been complicit? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Sophia entered, her expression grim. "Sir, there's something you need to see." Jonathan frowned as she handed him a tablet. The screen displayed an email sent anonymously to several major news outlets. The headline read, "Kane Empire Built on Lies. Documents reveal decades of corruption." Jonathan's stomach dropped as he scrolled through the email. It contained fragments of real documents mixed with fabrications, enough truth to make the lies believable. "They're running the story," Sophia said softly. "It'll be everywhere by morning." Jonathan's fists clenched. "Daniel," Sophia nodded. "It has to be him. He knew this was coming and prepared for it." Jonathan paced the room, his mind racing. The board might have stood by him today, but public opinion was another matter. Investors would panic, stock prices would plummet, and worst of all, Elijah would be dragged into the spotlight. "No," Jonathan said, determination hardening his voice. "We're not letting him win." By dawn, the headlines were everywhere. News vans lined the street outside the estate, reporters clamoring for a statement. Jonathan stood at the window, watching the chaos unfold below. Elijah entered the room, his face pale but resolute. "What do we do?" Jonathan turned to face him. "We face it head on." Hours later, father and son stood side by side at the podium in the company's press room. The cameras flashed as the reporters shouted questions, their voices merging into a deafening roar. Jonathan raised his hand, signaling for silence. "The past 24 hours have been some of the most difficult in this company's history," he began. "And I won't stand here and pretend that mistakes weren't made, but I will tell you the truth." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. "My son, Elijah Kane, is not the helpless figure the media has painted him to be. He is a fighter, and his journey back to his feet, both literally and figuratively, reflects the values this company was built upon." Elijah stepped forward. "I let fear control me for too long," he said, "but fear doesn't define me. I stand here today not as someone hiding from the truth, but as someone ready to embrace it." The room fell silent as Elijah straightened, no longer leaning on the podium for support. Jonathan took the microphone again. "As for the allegations against this company, I welcome the scrutiny. We will cooperate fully with any investigation, and we will come out stronger on the other side." Questions erupted, but Jonathan turned and walked away from the podium, Elijah by his side. Later that evening, Jonathan sat across from Sophia in his study. "What's the damage?" he asked. "The stock took a hit, but it's stabilizing," Sophia replied. "The board's standing firm for now, but we need more than just words to keep them there." Jonathan nodded. "Then we give them results." Elijah entered the room, his expression determined. "I want in." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "In? In the company. The board needs to see I'm committed, and so do you. No more hiding." Jonathan felt a lump rise in his throat. "Are you sure?" Elijah nodded. "I'm ready." Jonathan extended his hand. "Then let's rebuild this together." Across town, Daniel Harper sat in a dimly lit motel room, his phone buzzing with messages. The fallout from the press conference was worse than he'd expected. Jonathan and Elijah hadn't crumbled. They'd fought back. He poured himself another drink, his hands trembling. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the night deepened, Daniel's thoughts turned darker. He hadn't come this far to lose everything. If Jonathan and Elijah thought they'd won, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The Kane estate was unusually quiet. The heavy air seemed to press down on its walls, as if the house itself held its breath. Jonathan Kane stood in his study, staring at the city skyline as the morning sun crept over the horizon. He had barely slept. His mind replayed the events of the previous day: the press conference, Elijah's courageous stand, and the fallout from Daniel Harper's smear campaign. The headlines had been relentless. Articles dissected every aspect of the Kane family's past, speculating about the company's future and Elijah's sudden recovery. News anchors debated whether Jonathan could survive the scandal, while pundits painted Daniel Harper as a whistleblower exposing corruption. Yet, despite the storm outside, Jonathan felt something unexpected: hope. He turned as Elijah entered the room. The young man walked slowly, his steps still unsteady but growing more confident with each passing day. Gone was the boy who had hidden behind fear and excuses. In his place stood a man determined to claim his place in the world. "Mornin'," Elijah said, his voice steady. Jonathan managed a smile. "Mornin'." Elijah gestured towards the television, where a news anchor recapped the events of the press conference. "They're already tearing Harper apart. The financial records Sophia found are making waves." Jonathan nodded. "It's a start, but we're not done yet." Sophia entered, a tablet in hand. "Sir, the SEC has officially opened an investigation into Harper's accounts. The evidence we submitted was enough to freeze his assets." Jonathan exhaled. "Good. And the board?" "They're holding steady for now, but they need reassurances," Sophia replied. "We can't afford any more surprises." Jonathan turned to Elijah. "This is your chance to show them what you're capable of." Elijah's expression hardened. "I'm ready." Later that morning, Jonathan and Elijah arrived at Kane Industries headquarters. The atmosphere was tense, employees whispering nervously as they passed. News vans were parked outside, cameras aimed at the glass entrance. Jonathan ignored them, leading Elijah through the lobby and up to the executive floor. Inside the boardroom, the members were already seated, their faces tight with concern. Marcus Bellinger stood as they entered. "Jonathan," Marcus began, "we need answers." Jonathan held up a hand. "You'll get them. But first I want to introduce someone who has more than earned his place here." Elijah stepped forward. "I know I'm not what you expected," he said, his voice clear. "I know my story, my recovery, raised doubts. But I'm here now, ready to prove myself, and I'm not going anywhere." The room fell silent. Then Marcus spoke. "Let's get to work." Meanwhile, Daniel Harper paced his hotel room. Empty whiskey bottles littered the table and crumpled papers were strewn across the bed. The news wasn't going his way. The SEC investigation had frozen his accounts. former allies refused to take his calls. Even Marcus, his supposed confidant, had turned against him. He picked up his phone, dialing one of the few numbers he had left. "Pick up," he muttered. Finally, the line connected. "It's me," Daniel said. "I need your help." A pause. Then a voice replied, cold and sharp. "You're out, Daniel. There's nothing more we can do." The line went dead. Daniel slammed the phone down, his hands trembling. He wasn't finished. Not yet. Back at Kane Industries, Sophia pulled Jonathan aside after the board meeting. "We have another problem," she said, handing him her tablet. Jonathan scanned the screen. It was an email chain. Daniel's communications with a rival corporation. "He's been feeding them information," Sophia said. "They're trying to launch a hostile takeover." Jonathan's stomach tightened. "Can we stop it?" "We're working on it, but we'll need every ally we can get." Jonathan turned to Elijah. "Are you ready for this?" Elijah nodded. "We fight." The following days were a blur of meetings, negotiations, and damage control. Jonathan and Elijah worked side by side, countering Daniel's attacks and shoring up their defenses. Elijah proved himself in ways Jonathan hadn't expected, pitching ideas, calming nervous investors, and even addressing the media. Slowly, the tide began to turn, but Daniel wasn't done. He resurfaced with new accusations, claiming Jonathan had falsified records to cover up illegal activities. The allegations reignited the scandal, sending the stock into another spiral. Jonathan faced the cameras once again, this time flanked by Elijah and Sophia. "These accusations are false," Jonathan said firmly. "We have provided the authorities with full access to our records, and while this process has been difficult, we remain committed to transparency and integrity." Elijah stepped forward. "We're not afraid of the truth, and we won't back down." The statement resonated. Investors began to rally behind the Kanes, and the media narrative shifted. 1 week later, Daniel Harper was arrested. The charges included embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. As he was led away in handcuffs, reporters shouted questions, but he kept his head down, his face pale and defeated. Jonathan watched the footage from his office, a mixture of relief and exhaustion washing over him. Elijah entered, holding 2 glasses of whiskey. "We did it," Elijah said, handing his father a glass. Jonathan took a sip, savoring the burn. "No," he said. "You did it." Elijah smiled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. "This is just the beginning, Dad. We have a lot of work ahead." Jonathan nodded. "Then let's get to it." As the sun set over the city, the Kane estate stood tall, its glass walls reflecting the fading light. Inside, Jonathan and Elijah sat together, going over plans for the future. The battle had been hard fought, but the war had made them stronger. And, as father and son looked out at the horizon, they knew one thing for certain: no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The Kane estate basked in the golden glow of the morning sun. Its glass walls reflected the light, making the mansion appear almost ethereal, as though it existed outside the turmoil it had so recently endured. Yet, within its walls, the echoes of battle lingered, both the victories and the scars. Jonathan Kane stood on the balcony of his study, gazing out over the city skyline. The crisp morning air carried a sense of renewal, but his thoughts were anything but settled. The battle to save his company and his family's reputation had taken its toll. Daniel Harper was behind bars, but the damage he had inflicted would take time to repair. Jonathan gripped the balcony railing, his knuckles turning white. The past few weeks had tested every fiber of his being. He had been forced to confront his own fears, his failures as a father, and the vulnerabilities he had spent years trying to hide. And through it all, he had seen his son transform from a frightened, uncertain boy into a man willing to fight for his place in the world. A soft knock pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said without turning. The door opened, and Elijah stepped out onto the balcony. He no longer used the wheelchair, though his movements were still careful, deliberate. Dressed in a tailored suit that mirrored his father's style, he looked every bit the heir to the Kane legacy. "Mornin', Dad." Jonathan smiled faintly. "Mornin'. Couldn't sleep?" Elijah leaned against the railing beside him. "Not really. Too much on my mind." Jonathan nodded. "I know the feeling." For a moment, they stood in silence, watching the city wake up below them. "I keep thinking about everything that's happened," Elijah said finally. "About Daniel, the company, the lies I told, everything. It's hard to believe we're standing here after all of it." Jonathan turned to face him. "It's not over, Elijah. The fallout from this is going to follow us for a long time. The media, the investors, they'll be watching our every move, and we can't afford to slip." "I know," Elijah said, "and I'm ready." Jonathan studied his son's face, seeing the determination there. For the first time, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Elijah wasn't just saying the words, he meant them. "There's something else," Elijah said. "I want to take a more active role in the company, not just as a figurehead, but as someone who's actually involved." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "You're sure?" Elijah nodded. "I've spent too long hiding, Dad. I can't do that anymore. I need to prove, to myself, to everyone, that I deserve this." Jonathan's expression softened. "You already have." Elijah smiled, but his eyes were serious. "Then let's make it official." Later that day, the boardroom at Kane Industries was filled with the hum of conversation as the directors filed in. The tension that had hung over the room for weeks was finally beginning to dissipate, replaced by cautious optimism. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, Elijah by his side. Sophia stood near the door, her presence a quiet but steady reminder of the loyalty that had held everything together. Once the room settled, Jonathan rose to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "the past few weeks have tested us in ways none of us could have predicted. We faced betrayal, scandal, and uncertainty. But we stood firm, and today we begin the next chapter." He turned to Elijah. "I'd like to formally introduce Elijah Kane as my new partner and co-leader of this company." A ripple of murmurs ran through the room, but Jonathan raised his hand for silence. "Elijah has proven his resilience, his integrity, and his dedication, not just to me, but to this company, and I have no doubt that he will help lead us into the future." Elijah stood, meeting the eyes of each board member in turn. "I know I have a lot to prove," he said, "but I'm ready to do the work, and I promise you this, I won't let you down." One by one, the board members nodded their approval. In the weeks that followed, Elijah threw himself into his new role. He worked late nights, studied every aspect of the business, and made a point of meeting with employees at all levels. His determination began to win over even the most skeptical board members, and slowly the company's reputation began to recover. Jonathan watched with pride as Elijah stepped into the spotlight, handling interviews and investor meetings with the confidence of someone who had finally found his footing. But it wasn't just the business that had changed. At home, Elijah's recovery continued. The wheelchair was gone, replaced by hours of physical therapy and training. Jonathan often caught glimpses of his son pushing himself in the gym or practicing walking up and down the grand staircase. One evening, as Jonathan sat in the living room reviewing reports, Elijah entered with Sophia at his side. "We've been going over the numbers," Elijah said, "and we think it's time to expand, open a new branch in Chicago." Jonathan looked up, surprised. "Chicago?" Elijah nodded. "It's risky, but the projections are solid, and it would send a message that we're not just surviving, we're growing." Jonathan glanced at Sophia, who gave a slight nod of agreement. "Let's do it," he said. Months passed, and the Kane Empire flourished. The scandal that had once threatened to tear it apart faded into the background, replaced by stories of resilience and redemption. Elijah's story became an inspiration, not just to the company but to the public. Interviews and features painted him as a symbol of perseverance, and his leadership began to attract new investors and partners. Jonathan, meanwhile, found himself stepping back, trusting Elijah to take on more responsibility. It wasn't easy, letting go never was, but he knew it was the right choice. One evening, as they stood together on the balcony overlooking the city, Elijah turned to his father. "Thank you," he said. Jonathan frowned. "For what?" "For believing in me," Elijah replied, "even when I didn't believe in myself." Jonathan smiled. "You didn't need me to believe in you. You just needed to see what I've seen all along." They stood in silence, the city lights twinkling below. Far away, in a prison cell, Daniel Harper sat alone, staring at the cold, concrete walls. The empire he had tried to steal was thriving without him, and the name Harper had become synonymous with greed and betrayal. Jonathan Kane, however, had become something else entirely, a symbol of strength in the face of adversity. And, as Daniel's cell door clanged shut, the Kane legacy marched forward, stronger than ever. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share this video with your friends and write in the comments where you are watching from. Watch other videos on the channel. More exciting stories to come.